Good afternoon, one and all. Let me check my sound is going in. It is hello, my sport and exercise science cherubs. That's the name I'm going to use for you lot today. Whether you're watching this live, thank you very much if you are. I really appreciate that. Well, it's grey and grizzly here on a, what are we, Wednesday afternoon, 1st of May and that. Thank you for being here. Those of you that are obviously on demand, you can do whatever you want. If you're on the live stream, you can indeed pause the live stream and use what's called the DVR on it, so you can slow it down if you want to and do that sort of thing. But obviously, if you're on demand, you can do that as much as you want. What you can't do if you're live is go into the future. I'm afraid. No, it's not. I'm not capable of that one. Okay, with regard to today's sessions, folks, a couple of really, really important messages. First of all, I'm here on my own in the studio today. Normally, Marta sat opposite me, taking questions and things, but she's got a toothache and has gone to the dentist. So for that reason, guys, you can message in on the hub page, live chat for the live session, ask any questions you wish. Also, if you post anything onto social, we can pick it up on there and we can do any kind of shout outs and things like that that you feel you would like. So if you would like that, please feel free. Secondly, it's really important that you have the notes pages available to you when you take this session this afternoon if you're live. The notes pages are exactly what I'm going to work on the screen, and you will be following along on those notes pages. So I really, really recommend you doing that. I suppose you could do the session without the notes pages, but it's not going to be anywhere near as impacting as when you've got the notes page in front of you. With that in mind also, we have published a national mock exam for this unit, a mark scheme, and also model answers for that national mock exam. Guys, you need to learn those. I'll mention that again when we get into the session. But that is really, really important provision. Furthermore, you've also got the exam infographics, which show you some of the conditions and the details of your actual paper and perhaps what's going to be expected of you when you get into that environment and sit that paper. And we're going to look at quite a lot of those skills today. Finally, folks, we're really trying to push the YouTube channel and our free provision through the YouTube channel. So you guys hitting the like button on the video, whether you're watching live or on demand, you guys also subscribing to the YouTube channel. We're about to pass over 14,000 subscribers. Woo! That would be really, really valuable for us. It really helps us to get that material out for free, ongoing year on year on year. Without that, it's harder for us. So please do just give that little sort of tick of support, a click of support, I suppose might be the best way to say it. That would be really, really beneficial. Now, last thing before we get into this, when I change from my microphone here onto the canvas, I am changing microphones at that point. So you may just need to adjust your volume. You might find it comes out louder or slightly quieter. It's always hard to get those things to sort of tie up perfectly. So just be aware of that. We expect the session today to be in the region of an hour and 10 minutes, something like that. But we will definitely be finished before 4:30 today, because I've got another session for Cambridge Technical at 4:30, which I'm absolutely committed to. It's a live show. So we will be doing that one then. So no matter what, we will be finishing sometime between 4 and 4:30. It's difficult to be exact on what that's got to be. Okay, I think we are all set. This is always the nerve-wracking bit for me, where I switch over to the other stream. But if you've got your pens ready, I've got mine here with me, and I'm about to start my teaching. Here we go. Get your notes ready, folks. Okay, folks, bit of functional anatomy, Unit 2, Sport and Exercise Science. A couple of things I want you to be aware of, first of all, folks. Obviously, we're looking at this particular unit, that's clear. You really need to be taking this session with the notes pages associated. So you need to be filling the notes as I go through this, because you're effectively following me through the process. Also, folks, you really should be have awareness of your exam infographics. And we're going to focus, obviously, on certain skills today and certain processes. And you will see a representation of that in the infographics, which break down your exams into content and into skills and show you what you need to be good at. Also, we have written a national mock exam paper, mark scheme, and model answers to go with that. If you don't consume those, then you are not preparing for this exam, folks. I'm sorry to be so harsh and direct. You need to learn them. I'm sorry to be so kind of brutal about that, but we're producing them because they are impacting, because if you consume them, if you read them, answer them, mark them, learn the model answers, mark the model answers, you are going to become better in terms of your preparation for your own exam. So we really, really are insisting on that. Also, the only other thing I sort of want to dwell on here, sorry, just messed that up. The only thing I want to dwell on here is we're covering 8 topics in this session. I'll probably do 4 in the first half, on the second half we'll see how it goes. But also, I really want to focus on some exam skills, not just content. There'll be lots of content today, but I'm going to show you a couple of skills as well that hopefully are going to stand you in good stead. Okay, let's start somewhere pretty straightforward. Okay, we're looking at location, anatomy, and function of the heart. So obviously, in terms of location of the heart, we're talking about in the chest, within the thoracic cavity, just slightly to the left of the sternum, behind the sternum. But let's make sure that we can identify the vessels first of all. The upper vessels of the heart are the atria, folks, and we need to be able to stress that as we look at this, that is the right atrium at point A, and obviously as we look at this, this is the left atrium at point B. We'll get down into the roles of these things in a second. Then obviously my lower chambers here, these are my ventricles. And on the right here, we have the right ventricle, and obviously on the left, we have the left ventricle. Fairly straightforward sort of stuff at that point. I mean, sometimes students will get confused and get the left and the right the wrong way around, but make sure you don't, basically. And I'll come back to all of the vessels and valves in a second. Now, I want to dwell on a couple of points that are here on this image. Let me just go in slightly. I want to dwell on a couple of points here in the image. We have said here, for example, that the atria there, the upper chambers, agreed. But one of the things, and we'll come back to this almost immediately, I want you to be aware of, is that they contract independently. Okay, contract independently. So they go through their systolic independently. They go through their systolic phase separately to the ventricles. And what they also do is they push blood down. And of course, that is because the ventricles, which is the destination of that blood, at least for the atria's perspective, they are the lower chambers, sort of by definition. Okay. Now, the other point I just wanted to mention here, we talk about the atria being where blood is received. If I go back to the image here, of course, I've got the vena cava coming in here and here. Okay, so receiving here. We've also got the pulmonary vein coming back in here. Now, the reason I mentioned this is a nice way to think about that sort of reception of blood is the actual word atrium. Where have you come across an atrium before? What is it? It's an opening. It's an entry point. All those posh hotels you go into or big shopping centres, I'll meet you in the atrium. I'll meet, that sort of thing. That's what we mean by that. If your house has got an atrium, you got a nice house, let's put it that way. It's a big old opening, almost a room by itself. That's what we mean by an atrium. That is literally what that describes. Now, of course, our lower chambers are our ventricles. Now, a couple of things I want you to be aware of ventricles. First of all, they are powerful. And I can represent that to you because if we just go back to the illustration here, especially if you look at the muscular walls around the ventricles, they're much thicker than those around the atria. That's because, of course, they've got to apply more force. The only thing to mention beyond that is that the left ventricular wall is thicker than the right ventricular wall. Why would that be? Well, of course, it has got to propel greater amounts of force because it's, this side is propelling to the lungs, this side is propelling to the whole body. Now, it ends up making the left ventricle actually look smaller. Remember, this is an elastic environment. It can swell and expand, and that's what this does. So our muscular pump that way. Now, we've got the ejection idea. I want to stress to you that when we eject blood from the heart, that blood is ejecting into arteries. They're moving away. Okay, so that's what they're doing. They're into those arteries, and they do that through valves. Okay, so we're going to come back to valves almost immediately, but I just want you to make sure that when we eject blood, we're ejecting from the right side into the pulmonary artery, from the left side into the aorta. Now, I mentioned valves just now. Let's get into that straight away. We have got 4. I'll allow you to locate them and name them for yourself. Make sure that you can distinguish between the tricuspid on the right side and the bicuspid on the left side. That is your responsibility. But what I just want to introduce to you now is some terms. Let's imagine that we have got atrial systole. Okay, atrial systole. These vessels here, these openings here, they are contracting. When they do that, they force blood downwards. And when they do that, they force blood downwards through, on the right side, the tricuspid valve, and on the left side, the bicuspid valve. Now, the role of those valves, of course, is very, very specific. They are going to prevent backflow. But one of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, why would blood flow back in that direction? Well, in a moment, we're going to get ventricular systole. In fact, let me change colour. We're going to get ventricular systole, where the blood is going to be pushed back up and out of the heart. And of course, there's going to be a tendency for that blood to go back into the atria, unless, of course, we've got our bicuspid and our tricuspid on the left and right, respectively. That is exactly why they are there. They ensure that blood moves in a single direction. Now, you might be aware that valves can get a little bit damaged over the course of someone's life. They can get a little bit sticky. They can get a little bit flimsy. They can let things through. And of course, that's where valves need to be changed and replaced and strengthened. And there's numerous ways that can be done from the health side. You may well have studied this in biology. You may be studying it in A-level biology right now. I don't know. But those are factors we need to be considering. Now, the semilunar valves, the key thing to note about the semilunar valves, they are at the exit points of the heart. So these are at the exit points. So there's two ways of describing, let's say, the left side semilunar valve. There's two ways of describing it. One is you could say it exits the LV, the left ventricle, but it's also the entry point for the aorta. So with that in mind, guys, that's a really important point, because what we can say there is that again is preventing backflow. Once the blood is into the arterial system, into the arteries, we don't want it coming back to the heart unless it loops all the way back around that double loop of the circulatory system. And that is the role of valves. I'll just also challenge you guys, where else do we find valves in the circulatory system? Where else do we get these from? And hopefully, whether you're in a classroom or you're on, you should be telling me, well, James, we get these in veins. And it's for the same reason. Remember that in a vein has very low pressure blood, so the blood kind of gets shunted up during systole and falls back down during diastole, gets shunted up through systole. So the vein, the pocket valves in the veins perform the same role, but they're structured differently. I'm not going to get into that here. But that is what our heart valves are for. Now, guys, you need to learn these descriptions. I will leave that to you, okay? Just bear in mind the bicuspid valve can also be called the mitral valve at times. Just be aware of that. But obviously the other descriptions are relevant. Now, I just want to get over to our blood vessels for a second. Notice, folks, that the aorta and the pulmonary artery are our two primary arteries. Both are exiting the heart. Both are exiting the heart, exactly what I said over here. But of course, the difference is the aorta carries oxygenated blood and the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood. And that's right, because of course that's the role that they're going to play. The pulmonary artery carries blood up to the lung where it's going to be reoxygenated, etc., etc. Now, our vena cava, vena cava, I never know how to say that, and our pulmonary vein likewise are both veins. They both re-enter the heart. Now, a couple of things. The vena cava has inferior and superior. Just let me clarify that for you. Go back up to this image here. Notice that I've got the superior vena cava and the inferior, one from the lower body, inferior one from the upper body, superior. Notice also that they contain pocket valves, okay? And those pocket valves, as I mentioned before, allow that blood to travel in only one direction through that vein back to the right atrium when the blood is at its lowest pressure during the systolic phase, okay? Otherwise, you can have a read of those and make sure that you can describe those terms accurately. Okay, let's get down to the cardiac cycle, okay, folks? So let's get down to the cardiac cycle with a little bit of conduction system mixed in. So I want to talk you through a process and then we'll get through to the timings of this. First of all, I want to introduce you to the SA node. Now, ideally, you will write sinoatrial node for SA node, but just for now, we'll keep it nice and short, sinoatrial node. It's just here. What is its job? Its job is to emit a signal. It is also what we would call myogenic, so it is self-regulating, okay, so it sets its own tempo, but the electrical stimulation of the heart has its origin at the sinoatrial node. Now, we're going to move down in a second to another node here, but before we do that, I just want you to notice that this signal, I'll do it in yellow, crosses here. Now you've got to imagine the sort of the muscular wall of the atria are above what I'm drawing on. We've got a cross section here. So what we're getting there, and I'm going to show it up here, we are getting, let me go to a dark yellow, we are getting atrial systole. Atrial systole. That's what we understand by that process. In other words, notice the angle of these arrows. Effectively, they're pushing downwards. So atrial systole is going to push blood through our bicuspid and tricuspid valves down into the ventricles. That's what atrial systole is going to do. But it does something more than that. The signal from the sinoatrial node also communicates with this node here, and this is called the AV node, the atrioventricular node, called that, by the way, because it sits between or above the sort of the designation between the atrium and the ventricle. So the AV node, this is going to relay the signal. Okay, so the signal which has been emitted by the sinoatrial node is going to be received by the AV node, atrial systole is happening at this point, and then of course the AV node is then going to relay it, and that relay comes down here. Okay, it comes down here. Now, a couple of things. I'm going to go to this label first of all. Here, the heart separation is called the septum. So that wall, it's a muscle, and it separates the heart, not the signal, separates into left and right side so that the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood can never mix. That's what that's going to do. But the other label we've got here, this is for something called the bundle, and I never knew how to say this when I first learned it, of His. The bundle of His, and that is just here, okay? And that bundle of His, what it does is it separates the signal, and it separates the signal into left and right. So the septum separates the heart into left and right, fine. The bundle of His separates the signal. Why would it do that? Well, because that signal needs to travel down and around the heart. Why? Because it's going to cause systole of the ventricles and contraction inwards, like this. So we're going to get, if this signal is going to wrap around underneath, and it's going to now cause the blood to be squeezed up and out. Where's it going to go out of? Brrrup, out there. Where's it going to go out of? Brrrup, out there to the lung. Okay, that's what's going to happen. And of course, the final label that we've got here are our Purkinje fibers, Purkinje fibers. They're called all kinds of different things depending on what you read. And the job of these fibers is to distribute signal to every muscle cell. So this comes back to a really, really interesting point, and that is that those Purkinje fibers, which are obviously in the myocardium there, in the muscle wall of the heart, those Purkinje fibers, they are conducting that signal to every single cell. And that means that when this heart contracts, yours, mine, anyone's, it contracts fully. Okay, it contracts fully. This is called the all or none law. So I want to be clear here. Your heart is working at maximum contractile force every single contraction, at rest, during exercise, every single time. Now, it would be fair for you to ask the question, well then how does it get more forceful during exercise? And it's a neat little trick, to be honest with you. During exercise, more blood returns, which swells the heart and makes it fill more. So it's got like an elastic recoil. So at rest, you are working at maximum all or non-law contraction of the heart. But when you are exercising, you've got more blood venous returning to the heart. Therefore, the heart fills, swells. It recoils elastically like an elastic band, and therefore you get more force of contraction. It is not because more heart muscles, myocardia, are actually contracting. It is because the heart is filled, swollen. Swollen is a bit of a strong term, but it's filled up, it's extended, and therefore it snaps back with more force, just like an elastic band the further you pull it. Now, I think I've almost really talked to you about the role of these things. Just want to kind of just make absolutely sure. Systole refers to contraction, okay? And diastole refers to relaxation. So let's make sure we've got that absolutely clear. And of course, what we're saying is that the timing of atrial contraction, systole, and ventricular are different. The timing of atrial diastole and ventricular diastole are different. So let's just see if we can have a look at this. The entire timing of a heartbeat is 0.8 seconds. Now notice this is for contraction. The heart takes 0.8 seconds to contract and relax for that matter, which is why the average resting heart rate is 72 beats per minute. Figure that out, go calculate it if you want. So a couple of things I want to mention here for you, okay? A couple of things I want to mention for you. When we are talking about atrial systole, so atrial contraction forcing the blood down, this takes about 0.3 seconds, okay? Now, what that means is that meanwhile, our ventricles need to be relaxing at least 0.3 seconds to allow that blood to come in. So we're just going to say just slightly greater than 0.3 seconds for the ventricles to relax to receive that blood from the atria. On that basis then, what the ventricles will then do is contract for in the region of half a second to force that blood out. And therefore our atrial diastole, and this is where a little bit of maths will help you, is in the region of 0.7 seconds, okay? So they relax for 0.7 seconds. Actually, sorry, that's not true. What am I talking about? 0.5 seconds, okay? So 0.5 seconds of relaxation for the diastole. So we get this kind of inversion effect. We're saying here that one thing has to be relaxing while the other is contracting. I can make a little tune out of that. And those are some interesting timings for you. Just remember, atrial systole, its role is to contract and to force blood down. Ventricular diastole, its role is to contract and force blood up and out. Whereas atrial diastole is all about relax and receive blood. That would be both from the vena cava and the pulmonary vein. And then for relaxation of the ventricular system, we're going to have that as relax. And of course, what it's going to do is receive from the atria. Receive from atria. So, I'm not sure if I've confused the hell out of you going through that, but nevertheless, that is what we need to be thinking about. Okay, I want to talk to you about the function of the respiratory system and gaseous exchange. So let's keep going here, folks. And I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to draw for you on our existing image, and then I'm going to draw for you again on a new image. So this is what I'd like you to think about. We are breathing. You are doing it now. I'm doing it now. Obviously, we do it deeper and more when we are exercising. So we can call that ventilation. And what happens when we ventilate air, we breathe in and then we breathe out and then breathe in, breathe out. We bring a mixture of gases into the lung. Okay, mixture of gas. And amongst that mixture of gas, we have got a bunch of oxygen molecules. Now, these are O2s, molecular oxygen. They wouldn't be anywhere near this big, but nevertheless, I'm going to say there's quite a few of them. About 21% of the air, we get into an alveolus. That blue ball's an alveolus, by the way. About 21% of the air that goes in there is oxygen. So this little thing here is an O2, okay? Now, amongst that, we've also got a very small amount of CO2. Okay, so we've got CO2, very small amount there. Now, that is constantly coming in and out, in and out, in and out. That is happening all the time. Now, meanwhile, our circulatory system, we choose a nice red here, our circulatory system is lining up a column of red blood cells. Okay, a column of red blood cells. And it looks like this. We've got a red blood cell, we've got a red blood cell, we've got a red blood cell. They're a bit more sort of disc shaped than the round ones I'm doing on here. A bit more like that one I've just done. One like this, one like this. And of course, what's happening here, they're constantly moving in and through this capillary that is surrounding this alveolus. So we've got a situation here where we've got red blood cells continually passing the alveolus, look, in this direction, and passing out in this direction. Fantastic. But the other point to make here is that our red blood cells, because they're returning, let's say, from the working muscle, they are carrying CO2s. They are carrying CO2s. Now, I'm over-regging this. All I want to show here is that in the capillary, we've got a high concentration. I'll just put conc. We've got a high concentration of CO2, and that's in the blood. So we've got a high concentration of CO2. But notice that my concentration of oxygen is less. We've got a low concentration, conc, of oxygen. That is in the blood. Meanwhile, in my alveolus, we have a high concentration. We have a high, my pen's been really sticky here, apologies folks. We have a high concentration of alveoli. Sorry, we have a high concentration of O2, but of course, we have a low concentration of CO2. Now, if we take our basic biological principles, and if I say to you that the membranes between these two surfaces are partially permeable membranes, but also gases always move from high pressure to low pressure. That's an arrow, believe it or not. High pressure to low pressure. I'm going to rewrite that. Gases always move from high to low pressure. That's because of kinetic theory, the random movement of these gases, they're bouncing about, therefore the net movement is going to be thus. So what's going to happen here, folks, is that a bunch of oxygens is going to blip across, blip, 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 and we're going to leave here with lots of oxygen that's come through the partially permeable membrane from the alveolus. Why? The reason that is happening is because there is a diffusion gradient. How do I define a diffusion gradient? A diffusion gradient is when on one side of a membrane we have got high concentration CO2 and on the other side low. That creates a diffusion or concentration gradient, and therefore we get the movement of gases from high to low. Meanwhile, me old Cl2 mates, what they're going to do, is they're going to blip, blip, blip across. So what do we get? We get that gaseous exchange. Now again, I want to repeat a point I made at the start of this description. We are constantly ventilating that air. We've got a column of red blood cells constantly moving past. So this is an ongoing process, which means that the rate of diffusion stays high. Now, when we exercise, our rate of diffusion can go even higher. How does it do that? It does that because we breathe more air in, and therefore we reach more alveoli. It also does that because we breathe faster, so we ventilate the air faster. We also move the blood past faster through increased heart rate and stroke volume and blood pressure. It passes by faster. Therefore, we get a steeper diffusion gradient as a result of those things. So, as a result of that, we get a faster rate of diffusion. Now, that's all well and good. That's happening at the lung. Brilliant. But I just want to remind you, really, that it doesn't just happen there. This is going to be a rubbish drawing. I apologise. Here, folks, is a muscle. Imagine that's the top surface of a muscle. I don't know which one. Let's say your quadricep. And then running past that is a capillary. So down here, so just imagine here, this is a kind of a muscle tissue down here. It's going off to a tendon. It's going off to a tendon down here. We've got a muscle tissue here, some muscle tissue. And here we've got a capillary. By the way, this is a shocking drawing, just to be clear. But this time what we're going to do is we're going to have our red blood cells columned here. Brup, brup, brup. They're passing by. And of course, they've just come from the heart, or they've been to the heart recently. So what do they have lots of? Sorry, they've been to the lung recently, I should say. So they have lots and lots of oxygen. Okay, so they have lots and lots of oxygen. I'm drawing them in 4s, guys, because hemoglobin as a protein carries 4 oxygens. Now, there's millions of them on each red blood cell, so don't take that too literally. But what we've got here is in the blood, we've got a high concentration. We've got a high concentration of O2. Now, meanwhile, in the muscle, there's very little O2 because it's been utilized for aerobic respiration. Okay, and because it's been utilized for aerobic respiration, what's happening is it's producing lots of CO2, which of course is a product of aerobic respiration. So what's going to happen here? As the blood passes by, I've now got over here, I've got high concentration of O2 in the blood. In the muscle, I've got low concentration of O2, whereas in the muscle, I've got a high concentration of CO2, and of course here in the blood, I've got a low concentration of CO2. So of course, what's going to happen here is the opposite effect. My CO2s are going to blip across, blip across, blip across, and by the way, they then get carried on hemoglobin and dissolve in plasma. Meanwhile, me old O2 mates, my little reactants of aerobic respiration, they're going to blip across this partially permeable membrane and enter the cell ultimately to end up in the mitochondria, which is the site of all aerobic respiration. So that is what's going to happen. And guys, I'll just, I mean, this is going to be rubbish. I'll just draw a little, imagine there's a mitochondria in here, and this mitochondria has its sort of matrix and cristae at this end. These oxygens we've just brought across, they're going to end up in that mitochondria doing their aerobic respiration work. So that is what we mean by gaseous exchange. It happens at both the lung and at the muscle tissue. Okay, we've got a really nice summary here. I'll just go over it with you, okay? Just let me go in slightly, just so we've got this nice and clear. I just want to really show you a couple of terms that you should be tried to be using in your answers. Now, what is written here is exactly what I've just described, but I want to show you something. Let's look at gaseous exchange at rest, process of diffusion. But when we exercise, let's say submaximally in this case, we must say increased diffusion gradient or concentration gradient. The point is that word there is the word that's going to get us the mark. If we got to maximal exercise, we want to be saying something along the lines of further increase, even greater, yet even more diffusion gradient. We must be doing that. And of course, when we get to recovery, it's going to gradually return to rest. Okay? So the point I want to make in this table is not so much to read out to you those statements that are already there. You can learn those. But notice here, we've got net movement of gases down the diffusion gradient from high to low concentration across a partially permeable membrane. That's what we talked about. But at submaximal, it's greater quantities of oxygen, even lower concentration in the capillary. That is where your marks come from, folks. Make sure you make those qualifiers. Increase, further increase, greater quantities, yet, look at that one, yet even greater for sort of really high level exercise in that way. Okay, I think I've made my point there. Let me just drag down. Last thing for this little section, I just want you to notice something about the composition of air here, folks. What we're effectively saying here is that when we breathe in Oxygen makes up about 20 to 21% of the air. Carbon dioxide a tiny amount. A bunch of other gases, argon, neon, all kinds of other stuff. But most of the air we breathe in is nitrogen. Now, when we look at air we breathe out, most of the air we breathe out is nitrogen. Why? Because we don't absorb it, because there's no concentration gradient. There's the same proportion in the body than there is in the air. Therefore, we don't take it in. Anyway, that's not important. What I want you to notice is that the oxygen that is breathed out, the difference is 4%. In other words, we don't transport all the oxygen that is breathed in. We certainly don't utilize all the oxygen. So one of the things I want to mention to you is that human beings, are they efficient at extracting oxygen from the air? Well, given that we leave most of it in the air, you'd have to say no to that. Okay, you have to say no to that. So there's oxygen in the air, there's plenty of oxygen there, certainly at sea level, but we're not able to sort of draw out more of it. Now, meanwhile, of course, 0.04% of CO2, we're producing a ton of this stuff, and the air we breathe out, 4% of it now increases to be CO2, but it's still nowhere near the predominant amount. Now, this is where I want you to think, what happens if we start exercising? What happens if we start exercising? Well, we know that these values are not going to change. Those values are exactly what's in our atmosphere and around us. So that ain't changing unless you go up to altitude, right? That or space, even further into altitude. That ain't changing. But what would change here, folks, I'm just actually going to see if I can get... Oh, that wasn't meant to happen. Whoops. I thought that was going to get rid of just my text. But what would happen here is that perhaps we can get our oxygen level down to 14%. So we breathe in 20, we breathe out 14. Perhaps we can get our carbon dioxide level to beyond 4%. And that is because of what I've described to you above. We've got those increasing diffusion gradients, we've got those increasing rates of diffusion, and therefore we get this greater consumption of oxygen during exercise. What about if I said maximal exercise? Well, in this situation, ironically, even though it's probably anaerobic, in this situation, we might have less than 14% and much greater than 4% of CO2 breathed out. We get those distinctions and differences bigger, and that's the way we need to think about that particular topic. Okay. Oh, Marta, there we go. Half an hour done. Marta's back from the dentist. How did it go with the dentist?
Not very well.
Oh dear.
Yes.
Oh dear.
Never mind.
Getting old, eh?
Yep. That's basically the diagnosis.
Getting old. Just getting old. Just looked at it. Didn't even get you in the chair before that point.
Yep.
Good stuff. Any questions, Marta?
Yes.
Anything we've got come in from these bloody legends?
Yes. One question. What does it mean that an alveolus is partially permeable?
Okay. So what we mean by that, sort of going to GCSE biology a little bit here, but what it means by that is that the surface of the alveolus, see it as like a globule, a sac. That sac is made up of a series of what are called epithelial cells. And between those cells, they're kind of like ding, 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 ding. They're kind of connected cells, right? But between those connection points, there are spaces. And they're tiny, tiny spaces. But the other thing that's tiny is oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules. They're absolutely tiny. And those molecules are bouncing around randomly. They're not just in the lung. They're not just in the alveolus, just sitting there. Still, no, they're bouncing about. They have kinetic energy. Remember your stuff from GCSE biology. The more energy they have, for example, more heat. That's why the nose warms the air, for example. So they're bouncing about in there, and of course some of them bounce across through those gaps. That's in essence what it is. And of course, when you've got more of it on one side, let's say more oxygen in the alveolus than in the capillary, more of it's going to bounce the other way. It's going to blip across, diffuse across into the other side of that membrane, and that's what happens. And CO2 goes in the opposite direction, assuming that's what the concentration gradient is. But just to be clear, you will get oxygen going from the blood into the alveolus and CO2 going from the alveolus, because they are also bouncing. It's just that there's fewer of them in those particular areas. And because the blood is continually columned through, because the air is continually circulated and ventilated, got my terms mixed up there, then that diffusion gradient is maintained, and therefore that constant movement of oxygen into the blood and CO2 out of the blood can carry on whilst those processes are going on. So that's what we mean by a partially permeable membrane. You can think about it like a wall with little gaps in it. Okay, that's kind of a reasonable analogy, probably. It's a bit more flexible than that, obviously, but there's little gaps in little spaces that things can slip through. Tiny little things can slip through, and those little things are bouncing. Of course, some of them sometimes slip through, and And when you think about it just on that base level, it feels a bit non-intuitive, but you've got to remember there are millions of those little molecules. So if they bounce about enough, some of them are going through, right? Imagine imagine like the crystal maze final. What's that called? You know, when you go in the crystal dome, go in the dome, whatever it is, and there's ticket. Imagine that they're bouncing around everywhere, and of course some of them go out the gaps. That's what it's for. I was just wondering, actually, in crystal maze, I wonder if any of the gold tickets actually went in the little pigeonhole by themselves and have just randomly bounced and went in. But
maybe.
Might have had a valve. It might have had a backflow valve. Might have had a prevent traffic and needs force to push it through.
Yeah, I'm sure that was the case.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts, or does that answer the point you wanted to ask, Marty?
Yep, it does. I think.
Happy. Nothing from anyone else?
No, nothing from anyone else.
Okay, well, we've got about half an hour of content left to go, guys, so I'm going to push that through now. And stick with me, stick on those notes pages, keep making those notes. We're going to have a look at some model answers and some marking towards the end of this half an hour. And hopefully this will be useful. Let me just line this up. There we go. Make sure we get the feed. We're moving on to muscle fiber types. Here we go. Let's keep things going, folks. Now, I hope someone's spotted the error. Fast twitch fibers not called oxidative, they're called glycolytic. Little challenge to you folks out there. Did you spot it? Obviously, we did it on purpose. Little typo there. I'm going to argue here, although I don't agree with what I'm going to argue, I'm going to argue here that we have 3 muscle fiber types, and that if you were to take a muscle, let's say I draw. Let's say I've got a muscle here, sort of going down to its tendon down here. Okay, and if we were to do a cross section of that muscle, looks like a leg of lamb, doesn't it? What we'd find here is that this muscle is sort of broken up into units. Okay. And each of these little units, I'm not going to get into their details here, each one of those units, if I was to draw one out like that, each of these little units is made up of the same type of muscle fiber, okay? So it makes these kind of contractile units that are specialized for certain things. So perhaps this one is a really high, slow oxidative kind of muscle group, or what we call motor unit, and therefore it can produce lots of endurance type work. But the point I really want to make here is that this here is a continuum. And that definitely there's muscle fibers that sit just here and sort of in between, and maybe have really high levels of this, but also they have decent levels of this, so they fall in different categories. So we're very much sort of summarizing the idea here. Now also, folks, what I've done is I've given you all of the structural characteristics of the muscle fiber types already, so I'm not going to describe to you their appearance, their shape, their condition. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and get into some of their functional characteristics, and I'll do the slow oxidative type ones first, okay? So their functions are as follows. They have a high aerobic potential. They have a low anaerobic potential, okay? So that's something for you to consider. They have a low force production. They have a low speed of contraction. However, they are brilliant at fatigue resistance. Okay, notice the word resistance in there. They do not fatigue easily. They will keep going and going. They will fatigue at some point. The other thing is they recover quickly. So those characteristics make these fibers really interesting, and start to think about what type of performer would need a higher proportion of these fibers. Think about your triathletes, your endurance swimmers, your endurance cyclists, your marathon runners, what am I not forgetting, your midfielders, etc. There's loads of examples, obviously. These sorts of performers need a good proportion of these fibers because they perform those roles. And remember that when I say these fibers, we're talking about these units, these groups of fibers that within each group are all identical. Now, if we were to go the opposite extreme and look at our fast glycolytic here, folks, what have we got here? Well, we've got their structure, fine, but I just want to sort of compare. Well, these ones have got low aerobic output. For example, that's why it's low mitochondrial density, because that's the site of aerobic respiration. However, they've got really high anaerobic output. They have really high force of contraction. They have really high speed of contraction. Those things go hand in hand, of course. Think about power as an output. However, they are poor at fatigue resistance. They are poor at fatigue resistance, and they recover, relative terms speaking, slower or slowly. So, of course, imagine if I was just to just go back up to here. If I was just to pull this out, right, and we were to look at the end of it, let's just imagine that's looking right down the end of that, and I've got pink and orange. Imagine that I've got an orange bundle, fast, orange bundle, fast, but here I've got a pink bundle. These are not the colours, by the way. A pink bundle. Then over here, I've got like an orange bundle. Then I've got a pink one. Okay, what would this person be well suited to? Well, they've got a bit of a balance of fast and slow twitch units, and therefore they might be a bit of a games player. But there's enough there in terms of like the powerful movements for them to do powerful things. And that's the point I'm trying to make. We're talking about the proportion of fibers that make up a cross-section. We're talking about the proportion of fibers that make up a cross-section that is really interesting to start thinking about. Now, with that in mind, guys, I'm not going to bother by putting constantly just writing the word intermediate in the middle here. Intermediate aerobic, intermediate anaerobic. You get the idea. You can fill that out for yourself. But those 2A fibers, they sit in between and have the strengths and sometimes weaknesses of both groupings. They are an intermediary fiber. We consider them to be fast, but they're oxidative and they're glycolytic. They perform the aerobic and anaerobic functions. Not as well as the others, but nevertheless. Now, this is where I want to get to on this. I want to be thinking about these 4 performers on the screen here. We've got Sandra, Milo, I'm fairly sure was a tweenie. We've got Clinton, we've got Jan. Now let's look at their proportion of fibers, okay? So let's go with Sandra first. She's got 20% SOs, she's got lots of 2As, and she's got sort of a similar amount of fast glycolytic. So I'm sort of thinking, right, this person needs to be doing something that's focused on this, but they've got a bit of pace and they've got a bit of endurance. So I'm thinking here, ideally suited to something like 800 meter running or maybe 200 meter swimming. I sort of thought about why, because they've got very high 2As, fast oxidative glycolytic, which means that they've got that balance, that combination. What would they not be suited to? Well, I would guess this person's not going to be a 100-meter sprinter. This person's not going to be a marathon runner because they don't have that makeup unless they do significant training for that. So therefore, we're saying low FG fibers, for example, low SO proportionately. So that's why this person would be better suited. Let's take Milo. Yes, Tweenie. What have we got here? We've got loads of explosive fibers. So he's going to be doing some explosive. I'm going to say, what am I going to go for? I'm going to say that Milo lobs the javelin thrower. Okay. Why? Because he's got really high proportion of 2Xs, sometimes called 2Bs, of course, fast glycolytic. What wouldn't he be good at? Let's say triathlon, unless he did an unreal amount of training to reverse this. This is a low proportion, very low actually. It's actually very, very unusual. What would be the justification of him not being a triathlete? Because we've got exceptionally low SO fibers, and we can look at it that way. Let's think about Jan, legend. He's the opposite, right? He's got a whole bunch. He's got a really high proportion of slow oxidative. Maybe he is going to be, let's say, an endurance cyclist. I'm going to go for, obviously, choose whatever endurance event you want. Why? Because he's got lots of SO type 1. Fantastic. What is he not going to be very good at? 100 meter sprinting. Why? Because he's got low FG, fast glycolytic fibers, and he's got 11% of those bad boys. So he's not going to be an explosive type performer. And then finally, Clinton, which I'm going to put in brown. No insinuation meant. What we've got here is we've got much more of a balanced performer. Okay, so I'm thinking games. And because we've got someone here who's towards 51%, but has got good endurance as well, I'm thinking like a midfielder or in whatever game you prefer, a tennis player maybe, something like that. Why? Because they've got very high 2A, but also they've got balance across those different. And by the way, this is quite typical, quite common. Now, what would they be not suited to? Well, even though they've got a bit of this, again, they're 100 meters, they wouldn't be strong. Why? Because their lowest percentage would be the fast glycolytic. Now, again, can we just stress that training can influence these things? And remember what these are a proportion of. We're saying it's muscle fiber sample. This is a little bit misleading. It's about the percentage of the cross-sectional area of the muscle, which is why I showed you that little terrible drawing I did a minute ago, just to emphasize that point. Okay, let's drag down. Now, here, let's just have a look at this. We've got activity. Look closely at this model answer. By reading it, you should be able to work out the command for the question and also what the question is. So let's read it. Type 2X muscle fibers provide high contraction speed to allow a footballer to jump high and head the ball. Fine. These muscle fibers also provide a high force of contraction to allow the footballer to sprint quickly and powerfully and recover the ball after losing possession. Lastly, type 2X muscle fibers recover relatively quickly from exhaustion, so the footballer can continually attack and defend. Continue to attack and defend at sufficient intensity. Well, first of all, I don't actually agree with that. So I'm going to say that's not right. So I'm going to reject that comment. But nevertheless, what I think we're seeing here is we're seeing an analyzed response. Why do I think that? we're looking at the idea of breaking the concept into parts. So what the student is doing here is they're basically going into characteristic 1, functional characteristic 1, and explaining it. Then they're doing characteristic 2 and explaining it. Then they're doing characteristic 3, the recovery, and explaining it. Okay, not very well in this case. And I think what they've been asked to do here is analyze 2 X fibers for a games player of your choice. Okay, and that's, by the way, I make a point of not looking at these questions before I do these sessions, but that would be my estimation of what that question has asked that person to do. They've got to analyse the 2X fibre for a games player that the person chooses. Or maybe, in this case, it's a footballer. They've been asked to write about a footballer, let's say, for argument's sake, but maybe they can choose. That, for me, is what they've done there. And also, one of the absolute giveaways is they're using terms like lastly. When we get analyse answers, we often get this structure. Firstly, secondly, then obviously whatever they want to write. Lastly, this is a classic case of an analysed response, and that's why I think that is probably what we're looking at here. Okay, let's move down. I want to remind you of different types of contractions first of all. So what have we got here? We've got isometric contractions when pairs of muscles remain stationary, equal length under tension. Notice the word pair. Isotonic contractions have one of two things. They're either concentric, which effectively is when the agonist shortens, and we've got eccentric when the agonist lengthens under tension. So it's always the action of the agonist. The only difference is with an isometric contraction, we get at least 2 agonists in there. Now, teachers, if you don't believe me about that, go Google the principle of moments. Trust me, that is correct. And it's the only way that can happen. Now, let's have a look at the press up as an example. Agonist prime mover, same concept, okay? So what have we got here? Phase A is on the way up, phase B is on the way down. So we're looking at the upwards action here. So in the upwards action, we're looking at the elbow. Which movement is causing that to happen? Well, we've got elbow extension here. Okay, so we've got elbow extension. That's not part of the answer, but what muscle will achieve that? Well, that is the tricep, or the tricep brachii is going to achieve that. And it's going to achieve that through a concentric contraction. Why? Because the muscle is shortening under that tension. I'm not sure. If you don't believe me, go do a press up and you'll feel exactly that. Now, what about when this person starts to move downwards? Well, of course, what's happening now is that the agonist is acting as a brake. It's controlling and slowing the descent towards the floor. The muscle doing that is once again the tricep, which remains the prime mover or the agonist, and that is being done eccentrically. So that is an eccentric contraction. Let's move down. We've now got hip, knee and ankle for a vertical jump. So let's call this A and call this B. Obviously what we've got here is sort of, this is the downward action, this is the explosive upwards action, okay? So what have we got here? So we've got the takeoff phase. The gluteals on the way up, phase B, they are contracting concentrically, okay? To achieve that, they are shortening, they're causing in essence hip extension, and they're doing that. Now, we've also got on the landing here, the gluteals remain the prime mover. Why? Because they are acting as a brake and they are working eccentrically. And that is why that's the case. Now let's look at the knee. Of course, what's happening is when we go up, we're extending. When we come down, we're flexing the knee. So notice quadricep, quadricep, both times. Why? On the takeoff, the quadricep is contracting and shortening to produce extension. That means it's concentric. But when we land from the jump, down, landing, those quadriceps have to act as a brake and decelerate us, and therefore they contract eccentrically. Now I want to be clear here, that means the hamstring group, and by the way, you may want to mention your quadriceps, obviously rectus femoris, vastus intermedius, lateralis and medialis. But here what's happening is that the hamstrings, the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, bicep femoris, they are relaxing to allow this action to happen. Let's go further. Let's have a look at the ankle. Now, of course, what's happening here is on the way up, the gastrocnemius is shortening and contracting to pull the heel up. And therefore, that is a concentric contraction. But of course, when we're landing, the gastrocnemius remains the prime mover and it lengthens under tension, acts as a brake, and produces a braking effect through an eccentric contraction. Now, you might want to notice landing, 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 all eccentric. When we land from a rebound, from a jump, it tends to be eccentric contractions that slow that descent down. That is really a great description of what eccentric contractions are. Okay, I'll keep going here. I need a little pause for a breath a sec, but let's just go through. Let's just go through some planes of movement. So let me name them first of all. Here we have a sagittal plane. Notice spelling double T. Here we have a frontal plane, spelling obvious. Here we have a transverse plane. Now, the second thing I want you to think about here is that our descriptive language is always along. Okay, so I want you to use the words along. So what sort of movements happen along the sagittal plane? And we should be talking about flexion. You know, imagine, for example, this person flexes their hip. This person flexes, I'll make that more of a hip. Oh, God. If they flex, what about if they extend their hip back? That is movement along the sagittal plane. What about if they flex their elbow, so their elbow's there? That is movement along the sagittal plane. What about if they flex their head so it tips forward, nodding action? That is flexion along the sagittal plane. Those movements are along the sagittal plane. That is what's taking place there. What about the frontal then? And by the way, think classic examples, running action. Don't know what I've written there. Running action, bicep curl. We could be talking, well, I'll just leave it at that. Now, when we talk about frontal, we're talking about a different type of movement. Imagine this person moves their arm to here, to here, to here. What would we call that? We would call that abduction. What about adduction? If I move it back, what am I doing? I'm moving along that frontal plane, okay? So if I abduct my hip, bring it back down, I am moving along that sagittal plane. So think about movements. Think about a diving save of a goalkeeper. Think about a cartwheel. Think about, what else have I not mentioned? What else could this be? I think about a star jump. It's not a very good example, but I'll go with it just for now. There we go. And finally, let's look at this transverse axis. If something moves along this axis, what we're going to find that to be is that's going to be some form of rotation. And I want you to think about this in sort of really clear terms, right? That rotation could be the whole body, but it could simply be the arm rotating around its own axis. Okay, so we're getting things like spins. Let's call them half turns. Let's call them pivots, netball, basketball, whatever. We're pivoting. Those are movements along the transverse plane. And what I've tried to do with this image here is make that as clear to you as possible. Let me just zoom in a little bit so we can see a bit more clear. We've spent a lot of time on these images to try and make sure the reflections of things are just so for you. Look at the sagittal plane movement of this performer. Now, you might notice that arm has moved outside of that sagittal plane and probably in reality is actually moving a little bit on the frontal as well. That is because a lot of movements are combined planar movements often, but we tend to write them out as single. Our cartwheel along the frontal plane, remember, along the frontal plane. If we were talking about axes, it would be around the axis. Our transverse plane, this one's a really interesting one. Rotating in the circle only when discus thrown. So the only thing here which is along the transverse plane is the rotation. Once he goes and flexes his knee, flexes his elbow, moves his head, that's going to be probably along the sagittal plane. But notice here, it's along the transverse for that reason. So I think that's a really nice one to kind of summarize and to get to grips with. Quickest of breaks. Firstly, let me just scoot this image back in to make it more manageable size. The point I want to make here, folks, is that all sporting actions engage with phases. Now, we're looking at sort of a classic view of phase of movement here. Can I just stress that different types of performance have different phases, and we're looking at a very generalized sort of view of this. If we were looking at dance or gymnastics, we would actually be looking at different phases here to these, but nevertheless, we'll stick with these for now. Okay, what do we mean by the preparation phase? This is typically, if I was to write, this is typically the start of the movement. So it's typically the start of the movement. That's what we mean by a preparation phase. It's typically some kind of, you might refer to it as some kind of backswing or pre-movement. Sometimes we even call it a trigger movement, trigger. Okay, so even a trigger movement can be a preparation. We're effectively getting into a particular shape. Now, one thing that's interesting about this, it's often in opposition to execution. So think about, I don't know, a rugby player kicking a rugby ball, for example. You're going to kick by flexing the hip forward and extending the knee and plantar flexing the ankle. When we do the preparation, we do the opposite of that. We extend the hip we flex the knee, etc. So we often the opposite movement to the execution itself. By the way, little typo, execution should be in here. Apologies for our little bit of typo blipness. What we're describing here is that this is the main movement. Okay, so this is the kicking action, striking the leg through the ball, let's say, for example. Very often it involves some kind of collision. Okay, now collisions, I'm not going to get into this biomechanically, but collisions are whenever two surfaces come in contact with one another that carry force, which is always. So this could be a foot striking a ball, and of course, Newton's third law, the ball is also technically striking the foot. We get equal and opposite reaction. And this is also what we'd call the performance of the skill. It's a performance of the skill. It's a performance of the skill. So, for example, I've got my kicking action, the striking of the ball itself, a little bit after, but not the follow through yet. That's what we're talking about. It is actually in combat, the arm going forward and striking the opponent in a punch or whatever the equivalent would be. It would be the catching of the ball in a cricket example or rounders example. It would be the actual action of doing that. Now, the follow through kind of does what it says on the tin, right? But we often refer to this as the recovery phase. And there's a couple of little intricate points I want to make here. It's not just about following through. You imagine a tennis racket swinging over a shoulder. It is that, but it also involves the performer regaining. So we need to regain position. So the recovery after a movement, think about a cricket bowler who bowls at pace and then bowls, and they have to get back into a fielding position quickly. We need to regain position. With actual follow-throughs, we're talking about momentum here. Often the momentum carries through, but what a lot of performers will do is either lack momentum to create a follow-through, or they'll cut it short. People shouldn't do that. And often what a recovery does is we often get readjustment, not necessarily in the action we just made, but readjustment because of the action we've just made to go and do the next thing that we've got to do in the performance. So we often find readjustment in that scenario. So we've got three phases: preparation, execution, or more specifically execution, and we've got follow through. Okay, change your canvas. Okay, let's see if we put this into an example. We've got here, we've got a forehand, we have got a slice, and we have got a serve in this, what appears to, that's at least what I'm seeing in this table tennis performance here. So that's what we're looking at. So let's go through preparation. What's the weight transfer going to be? Well, first of all, we're going to say it's from front to back leg. Okay, so the back leg is going to be where the weight gets transitioned to. What's the arm position going to be? Well, we're in here, obviously, we've got sort of like the shoulder is abducted, but we've got the elbow which is flexed. Okay, and what's the hip rotation? Okay, so what they're doing is she's rotating. If I was to describe this in that direction, say she's rotating clockwise in the preparation, that appears to be fairly reliable. However, let's look at the execution. She's now going to strike through this ball in this direction here. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to now have from back to front in terms of weight transfer. The arm position is going to become more flexed. It's relatively flexed, become more flexed, and her rotation is going to be in this direction, so it's going to be anti or counterclockwise. Okay, so anti-clockwise. Now, what about the follow-through? She's going to follow through, obviously, and keep going in that kind of direction with her arm. The follow-through is going to be the weight's all going to be on the front now, but as she readjusts, she'll go back to neutral, ready to hit the third ball. Technical term in table tennis, don't worry if you're not sure what it means. The arm position, we're now going to have an extended elbow, but she's going to need to bring that back to the ready position as quickly as she can. Okay, so it's going to be extended, but it's going to have to come back to the ready position. And in terms now of rotation, well, she's now going to rotate back this way, and she's going to get back to her ready position, which is going to be a clockwise rotation. We just want to look at these movements as a whole. Now, final topic of the session, folks. Big one, interrelationship of muscular and skeletal systems. Now, when you get your movement analysis question, I want to make sure that you guys are aware of what you can get marks for. First of all, you can get marks for saying which bones are involved. You can say, you will know there will be a minimum of 2 bones involved in the movement analysis you're going to be given. Minimum, okay? And it's probably going to be more. Now then, with regard to muscles, you can get credit for numerous things. You can get credit for talking about muscle pairs. You can get, the prime mover and the antagonist. You can get credit for talking about the synergists, the ones that aid the movement. You can get credit for talking about the fixator muscles. And you can also get credit for talking about contraction type. So in your answers, we're going to look at one in a second. Try and get that into your answer. What about what credit can you get for joints? Well, you can say what type of joint it is, and you can also talk about which bones articulate. Okay, so the bones that meet at that joint, articulating bones. Now, obviously, that overlaps here with our bones to be included. Let's take it further. What about the types of movement? Well, you need to be recognizing, is it flexion? Is it extension? Is it abduction, etc.? That's effectively the skill that's going to get you credit in these answers. Furthermore, for the planes, you need to be able to identify which plane is being moved, and you must say that that movement is happening along that plane. And then finally, guys, when we talk about movement efficiency, there's a few things you can get marks for here. First of all, if you talk about dynamic stability, this is where we keep balance even though we're moving in performance. That's going to get you credit. If you talk about kinetic chain, this is a nice way to think about kinetic chain, is when we kick, strike, catch, land, jump, run, whatever it is, what order are things happening in at the leg, at the arm, at the chest, or whatever it happens to be? If you give that chain, that's going to be useful to your answer. Also, how is movement transferred? So think about that weight transfer that I just referred to in the example above. That's going to help you. And finally, if you make reference to balance, and especially muscle balance, okay, which muscles are contracting more, less, more forcefully, stronger, etc., that's going to get you credit. Okay, so let's look at an example. We've got a question here. Review the image of an athlete completing an overhead pass. Analyze how the axial and appendicular skeletons allow the movement necessary. And we're looking at my pen's gone funny, at the elbows, the wrists, and at the right ankle. Notice this is not the left ankle, which remains on the floor. So first of all, we're asked to analyze. Remember, that is break down and explain each part. So this is probably going to feel quite repetitive. And with that in mind, I just want to bring a potential answer in for you. We'll just spend a little bit of time with this. I think it's here. There we go. So what have we got? So at the elbows, let's just mark this to a degree. I'll only give circles, no marks, obviously a level question. In order to complete a successful overhead pass, elbow extension, there's my... What have I done there? There's my... my pen's not working. So my elbow extension, I'll try it one more time. Why is that not happening for me? Oh, I see why. I'm on the wrong layer. Sorry, guys, I was writing on a layer below. So there's my elbow extension. The elbow is a hinge joint. There's my type of joint. Articulating bones are the humerus and the radius, so I'm getting my bones in there. Elbow extension, the movement patterns along the sagittal plane as the ball moves from behind the player's head to the point. Now that there is a little bit of the phases that I referred to. Now, guys, can you just see, if I was to go back to that previous sort of bubble map we had before, I've included lots of that in my answer. Let's go to the wrist. It's a condyloid joint, type of joint. Bones are carpals and radius. Wrist flexion, sagittal plane, should be a long, that should be a long there. As the pass is executed, there's my execution term. The ball is flicked out of the hands. Now again, I could talk more about the specific prime movers and antagonists, but I'm getting plenty of credit from the table above. Right ankle, the right ankle is the hinge joint. Tibia and tarsal, specifically talus. Plantar flexion, ball is released to allow the player to put up on their tiptoes, and they can stay balanced. There's my kind of balance and dynamic movement as the ball is passed. Can you guys kind of see how the credit that I am awarding in that particular example is from, I haven't achieved all of it, but is from here. I think that answer could be better if I was to do things such as specifically say which muscle were the antagonistic pairs. Maybe that means it's not a full mark answer, but something just below. Does it mean then we get a 7 out of 8 or something like that because we need to talk about that muscular involvement? Perhaps. But the point is, the things that you're seeing circled there, the credit that I've given, are from that grouping above. And folks, how can I say this? Ironically, coincidentally, answering these questions is quite mechanical. If you learn the things you need to put in and you have an awareness of how the body moves, you're going to get marks on this. So with that in mind, I encourage you to go back to here and ensure that you're covering lots of that content in each of your interrelationship answers when it comes to movement analysis, musculoskeletal system. Big breath. I think we're done. There we go, folks. Whew. What a session, just over an hour. Hopefully useful. Plenty there. Any questions or requests, Marta?
No.
Any kind of shouty outiness?
No, we haven't got any shouty outiness. I've checked,
no,
but they...
no shouty out. Do you want to shout out?
To my dentist.
Yeah.
For taking a look.
Yeah, fair play to Marta's dentist.
I
I wouldn't want to go back there.
No.
No, it's brave, if I'm honest. It's brave. It's like the depths of hell.
That's exactly what it feels like at the moment.
Is it bad? Is it?
Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, well, we don't have any questions. We don't have any requests. We don't have any shout outs, but what we do have is an hour session behind us and everyone's happy and everyone's feeling glorious. So what we'll do is we'll put the music on for the outro and we'll wish you a wonderful evening, folks. Thank you very much for taking part. And if you're doing this on demand, I hope it's useful. Sorry, Martin, what's that?
I was going to say all the very best for the exam.
Oh, yeah, get on with it. Get stuck in. All right, cheers, guys. Have a good one.